My mother has a gift for precision cruelty. Not the shouting kind. Not the dramatic kind that leaves marks you can point to later when someone asks what happened. The quiet, surgical kind, the kind she delivers in a half-smile with her voice perfectly level, in front of exactly the right number of people, at exactly the wrong moment for you to respond without looking like the problem. I had spent 38 years learning to absorb it. 38 years of swallowing the sentence, walking away with my chin up and my hands steady, telling myself it didn't matter, telling myself she didn't mean it, telling myself the version of the story she told everyone else wasn't the only version that existed. But the afternoon my mother stood at my sister's wedding reception in a pale gold dress she'd had tailored 3 times, raised her champagne flute in a toast, looked directly at me across a room of 200 people, and called me a scratched label. She made one miscalculation she hadn't accounted for in 38 years of carefully constructed cruelty. She forgot about Eli. She forgot that my 12-year-old son had been sitting 3 seats to my left, watching everything, the way children watch when adults assume they aren't paying attention. She forgot that he had inherited exactly 0 of my talent for swallowing things quietly. And she had absolutely no idea what he was about to say. If you're finding this story hitting close to home already, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from. I genuinely love reading every single one. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand what Eli said in that reception hall, you need to understand what my mother had been saying about me for a very long time. My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 38 years old. I live in a 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburb of Columbus, Ohio, with my son Eli, 2 house plants I keep accidentally overwatering, and a home office that looks like a spreadsheet exploded into a design studio. By any reasonable measure, my life is good. Actually, by most measures, my life is exceptional. I run a boutique brand strategy consultancy called Meridian Creative. I built it from nothing over the last 10 years, working from a kitchen table after Eli went to bed, taking every client I could find, doing work I believed in even when the checks were smaller than my anxiety. Last year, Meridian billed just under $412,000. I have 11 ongoing client accounts, 3 full-time contractors, and a wait list. I say all of this not to impress you, but because you need to hold that number in your mind for later. $412,000. Remember it. Because my mother, for the entirety of those 10 years, told anyone who asked about my career that I did a little social media stuff from home. That I played around on the computer while Eli was at school. That it kept me busy, which was lucky, because Lord knows I needed something to keep me occupied given the choices I'd made. The choices I'd made. That phrase has followed me my entire adult life like a second shadow. I was 25 when I got pregnant with Eli. I was not married. His father, a man named Daniel who had the emotional availability of a parking meter, left before Eli's first birthday and has contributed roughly $1,100 in child support across 12 years of court orders. When I found out I was pregnant, my mother did not ask how I was feeling. She did not say we'll figure this out together. She looked at me across the kitchen table in the house I'd grown up in, pressed her lips together in that particular way that compresses an entire opinion into a single expression, and said, "Well, I suppose this is who you are." I was 25. I didn't know yet who I was. But she'd decided. My sister Cassandra is 3 years younger than me. She has always been the organized one, the practical one, the one who made choices our mother could describe at brunch without lowering her voice. Cassandra became a dental hygienist at 24, bought a condo at 27, and started dating Marcus Webb, a software project manager with a firm handshake and a reliable retirement account, at 29. They got engaged on a Tuesday in February at a restaurant I genuinely couldn't afford to eat at, and within 48 hours my mother had texted the entire family a photo of the ring with 3 exclamation points and the caption, "Finally, everything we always wanted for her." 3 exclamation points. I looked at my phone for a long time after that text arrived. I told myself the finally wasn't about me. I told myself the everything we always wanted was just about Cassandra, just about her happiness. I had been telling myself comfortable lies about my mother's cruelty for so long that I had almost gotten good at it. The wedding was planned for 14 months. 14 months of weekly phone calls between my mother and Cassandra that I was never invited to join. 14 months of vendor visits and cake tastings and bridesmaid dress fittings where my opinion was occasionally requested and then immediately overruled. I was asked to be a bridesmaid, which I took as a gesture of inclusion until I understood the terms. I was to wear a coral satin dress in a shade that made me look, as my Aunt Patricia generously put it, a little washed out. I was to sit at table 11, which was 3 tables further from the head table than any other member of the immediate family. And I was to bring Eli, who had been specifically seated at the children's corner near the back, next to Marcus's 7-year-old niece and a boy Eli had never met. Eli, who was 12 and had not sat at a children's table since he was 7 and who had, by the morning of the wedding, already read 2.5 chapters of a Robert Caro biography he'd found on my nightstand. But family events had their own gravity, and I had learned long ago that resisting the seating chart was a battle that cost more than it was worth. We went. We wore the coral. We sat where we were told. I need to tell you about my mother, Gloria Callahan, because she is not a cartoon villain. She is something more complicated and in some ways more damaging than that. She is a woman who genuinely believes that everything she has ever done was motivated by love. She would tell you, if you asked her, that she pushed me harder because she saw more potential in me. That she was harder on me because life is harder on women who make certain choices, and she was trying to prepare me. She would say that she worried, that she is a worrier, that worry comes out sideways sometimes, that she never meant to make me feel diminished. She would believe every word of it while she said it. That is the thing that makes precision cruelty so hard to fight. When the person delivering it genuinely cannot see what they are doing, every attempt to name it becomes evidence of your own instability. I tried to name it once, when Eli was 3 years old and my mother referred to him, within his earshot, as an accident that worked out. I told her that was cruel. She told me I was oversensitive. She told me I had always had a tendency to catastrophize. She told me she was sorry if I felt that way, which is a sentence specifically designed to apologize for your feelings rather than for the thing that caused them. I stopped trying to name it after that. I just absorbed it and built my business and raised my son and tried to become so quietly successful that someday the weight of the evidence would become impossible to ignore. I was still waiting for that day. I didn't know it was 14 months away. The wedding was on a Saturday in September, the kind of day that looks like it was designed by a committee of people trying to make September look its best. The venue was a renovated historic mill outside of Columbus, all exposed brick and string lights and a catering staff in matching black aprons. 214 guests, according to the program I was handed at the door. The ceremony was beautiful. I will say that honestly. Cassandra cried during the vows, the real kind of crying, and Marcus looked at her like a man who understood exactly how lucky he was. For 45 minutes during that ceremony, I forgot every complicated thing about my family and just felt glad my sister had found someone who looked at her that way. And then the reception started, and my mother found the microphone. Gloria Callahan was not the maid of honor and she was not the best man, and the speeches portion of the reception had technically concluded. Marcus's father had given a warm, rambling toast that ended in applause. Cassandra's college roommate had made everyone laugh with a story about a road trip to Savannah. The DJ was already queuing up the first dance. But my mother had been waiting all day for a microphone, and she had a particular talent for finding moments that belonged to other people and widening them to include herself. She caught the DJ's attention from across the room. She said she just wanted to add one more thing. And the DJ, who did not know my family, smiled and handed her the microphone. I was sitting at table 11 with my back partially to the head table, talking to Eli about the Robert Caro book because he had not been able to put it down even at the reception and had it tucked under his chair. I heard my mother's voice come through the speakers and I turned around. She was standing at the front of the room in her pale gold dress, champagne flute raised, smiling at the crowd the way she smiles when she knows she has an audience. She talked about Cassandra's kindness. She talked about how proud she was. She talked about the Webb family and what a beautiful match this was. All of that was fine. All of that was the kind of thing a mother says at her daughter's wedding. But my mother has never been able to stop before the sentence that should have been the last one. She has a compulsion, I have noticed over 38 years, to say the one more thing. The thing that reframes everything that came before it. The thing that tells you what she actually wanted to say. She raised her glass a little higher. She looked out across the room. And then she looked at me. I always told my girls, she said, her voice carrying the particular warmth she reserves for public sentiment, that life is like a shelf of beautiful things. Some items are perfect. Pristine. Never touched wrong. She paused, and I felt the pause the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. And some things, well. She tilted her head in my direction. Not a cruel gesture, she would say later. Just a small gesture. Just indicating. Some things are scratched labels. Still useful. Still on the shelf. But you know when you look at them that they've been handled a little rough. Soft laughter from a few tables. The uncomfortable kind that comes out before people realize what they just heard. Cassandra has always been my pristine one, my mother finished. And we are so proud. 214 people applauded. Some of them had not fully processed what had just been said. Some of them had and were looking at their plates. The DJ started to take the microphone back. Cassandra, at the head table, had a smile on her face that didn't reach her eyes. Marcus looked at his father. My mother descended from the small stage area near the DJ booth with the composure of a woman who has just said something she considers both true and generous. I did not move. I sat at table 11 with my coral satin dress and my hands in my lap and a humiliation so specific, so publicly delivered, so precisely timed that it had the quality of something that had been rehearsed. My face was composed. I had 38 years of practice at composed. I felt the eyes of a few nearby tables land on me and shift away. I heard someone at table 10 whisper something and heard the response, which was just a soft sound of sympathy. I looked down at the white tablecloth and I counted to 5. I had learned a long time ago that counting to 5 gave the worst of the heat time to pass before I had to look up and perform normal. I got to 3. Because before I reached 5, before I had decided what my face was going to do and what my body was going to do and how I was going to get through the rest of this evening, I heard the sound of a chair scraping back on the polished hardwood floor. I looked to my left. Eli had put the Robert Caro book under his chair. He had pushed back from table 11. He was standing up. He was 12 years old and he was standing up in a room of 214 adults and his face had a look on it that I had only seen a handful of times before. Not anger. Something older than anger. Clarity. The look of a person who has been waiting for a moment and finally recognizes it. Actually, Eli said, and his voice came out steadier than I expected a 12-year-old's voice to come out, I just wanted to say something about my mom. The room shifted in the way rooms shift when something unexpected happens and no one is quite sure whether to stop it. The DJ half raised his hand toward the microphone. My mother turned from where she had been accepting a compliment from Marcus's aunt. She looked at Eli the way adults look at children who have said something at the wrong time, with an expression designed to signal that he should sit down. Eli did not sit down. He looked directly at my mother across the room, and in a voice that carried without needing a microphone at all, my 12-year-old son said 7 words that turned table 11 into the only table in that room that mattered. I am going to stop here because what Eli said next, and everything that followed it, is a story that deserves its own space. But I need you to understand something before we get there. The reason Eli knew what to say was because he had been watching me for 12 years. He had grown up in that home office. He had fallen asleep on the couch while I was on client calls. He had helped me stuff envelopes for a marketing kit when he was 8 years old because I couldn't afford to hire anyone. He had watched me close my laptop at midnight and open it again at 5 in the morning. He had watched me build something from nothing, quietly, without asking anyone's permission or approval, without ever once getting credit from the woman who raised me. He knew exactly who his mother was, even if no one else in that room did. And he had decided, at 12 years old, with a steadiness that still takes my breath away when I think about it, that today was the day that changed. Eli said, "My mom's company made $412,000 last year. She has 11 clients. One of them is in this room right now." He said it the way he says everything, without drama, without performance, just the clean delivery of a fact he had decided the room needed to have. Then he sat back down, picked up his water glass, and took a sip. As if he had simply corrected a math error on a whiteboard and was now waiting for the class to catch up. The room did not catch up immediately. It does not work that way. What happened instead was a particular kind of silence, the kind that arrives not because nothing is being said but because too many things are being said at once, internally, by 214 people simultaneously recalibrating what they had just witnessed. I heard someone near table 9 exhale. I heard the clink of a fork being set down. I heard, from 3 tables away, the precise sound of a champagne flute being placed on a tablecloth with more care than it required. My mother's face did something complicated. It moved through 3 expressions in the span of about 2 seconds, surprise, then recalibration, then a smile. The smile was the most dangerous one. It was the smile she deploys when someone has said something inconvenient and she needs to determine whether it can be made to look small. She turned toward Eli with the patience of a woman who has had decades of practice managing rooms. "Isn't he sweet?" she said, to no one in particular. Her voice had that texture of affectionate dismissal she uses for things she wants to diminish without appearing to diminish. "Such a proud little boy." Little boy. Eli was 5'4". He was reading Robert Caro. He ran the Instagram account for my business when I let him, and he had, the previous spring, correctly predicted which of 2 proposed logo revisions a client would choose based on, as he explained it, their LinkedIn photo energy. He was not a little boy. But my mother did not know this because my mother had never asked. She had never asked because she had already decided what Eli was, the same way she had already decided what I was, a scratched label, a handled thing, a consequence of choices rather than a person building something. I put my hand on Eli's arm. Not to stop him. He had already said what he was going to say, and I could feel from the stillness in his body that he was not going to say more. I put my hand on his arm because I needed to touch something real. Because I was sitting at table 11 in a coral satin dress that washed me out and my mother had just called me damaged in front of 214 people and my 12-year-old son had stood up in response, and the combination of those 2 things was doing something to my chest that I had no name for yet. It was not sadness, exactly. It was not rage. It was the specific feeling of being seen and shattered at the same time. Across the room, at a round table near the windows that faced the mill pond, a man I had been aware of since the ceremony began was now looking directly at me. His name was Richard Okafor. He was 44 years old, a senior vice president at a regional healthcare marketing firm called Caldwell and Pine. I knew his name because I had been his brand strategist for the last 3 years. Meridian Creative had rebuilt Caldwell and Pine's entire content identity from the ground up, their patient communication framework, their provider outreach campaigns, their annual report design system. I had billed them $87,000 over the course of our engagement. Richard was at this wedding because he was Marcus's former college roommate and one of his closest friends. I had known he would be here. I had spent 3 weeks before this wedding deciding whether to say anything to Richard, whether to mention the connection, whether to sit with the coincidence or let it pass unnoticed. I had decided to let it pass. I was good at letting things pass. Richard was no longer letting it pass. He was looking at me with an expression that was sorting itself out in real time, the particular expression of a person connecting 2 separate mental files and realizing they belong to the same folder. He looked from me to Eli. Then he looked at my mother. Then he looked back at me. I met his eyes. He gave me the smallest nod, the kind that means I see what's happening here. If you're still with me at this point in the story, I have to ask, are you the person in your family who is perpetually underestimated? Drop your answer in the comments, because the support in this community is something I genuinely treasure. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do, it helps me keep bringing you stories like this one, and it means everything. My mother had moved on from Eli's comment the way she moves on from everything that challenges her framing, by narrating over it. She was now talking to Marcus's mother, Patricia Webb, a small warm woman from Cincinnati who had the natural grace of someone who has never felt the need to establish her importance in a room. They were standing near the dessert table. My mother was describing the venue as charming in the tone she uses for things that don't quite meet her standards. I watched her without looking like I was watching her, which is a skill I have spent a lifetime developing. What she did not know was that Richard Okafor had stood up from his table near the windows and was crossing the room toward table 11. He arrived with the easy confidence of a man who is accustomed to entering conversations midstream. He looked at me and said, "Nora Callahan. I had no idea you were Marcus's sister-in-law." His voice was warm, genuinely surprised, the tone of a professional who is delighted by an unexpected connection rather than unsettled by it. I stood up. We shook hands. "Small world," I said. "You didn't mention you'd be here. I didn't know you and Marcus were close until recently." Richard shook his head slowly, a small smile on his face. "The rebrand you did for us last year." He glanced around the room, then back at me. "Do you know that our patient retention numbers went up 11% after we rolled out the new communication framework?" 11%. I presented it to the board in March. I have told probably 7 people that story in the last 6 months. He laughed. "And now I find out you're at this wedding sitting at," he glanced at the table number, table 11. He said the number with the faint inflection of a man who understood that table 11 was not where someone like Nora Callahan should be sitting. Eli, who had been pretending to look at his phone, was not looking at his phone. "Richard, this is my son, Eli," I said. Richard extended a hand to Eli with the same seriousness he would give an adult. "Your mom is exceptional at what she does," he said. Eli shook his hand and said, "I know. Moments exist in life that do not announce themselves as significant while they are happening. You recognize them only by their texture, a slight thickening of the air, a quality of attention in the room, the sense of a thread being pulled from a much larger piece of fabric." The conversation between Richard and Eli and me at table 11 had that quality. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was a quiet rearrangement of information in a room where the wrong information had been in place for a very long time. My mother noticed. I cannot tell you the precise moment she registered Richard Okafor standing at table 11 because I was not watching her face when it happened. What I can tell you is that she materialized at my elbow with the speed of a woman who has excellent social radar and an unshakable instinct for territory. She arrived carrying her champagne glass and her pale gold composure, and she inserted herself between Richard and me with the smoothness of someone who has been doing this for 30 years. "Richard," she said, warmly, as though they were old friends. "Isn't this a beautiful evening?" "Mrs. Callahan," Richard said, with the measured courtesy of a man who has sat in enough board meetings to recognize a power maneuver when he sees one. "I just love that you and Marcus have stayed so close," my mother continued. "He's such a wonderful man. We are so relieved Cassandra found someone so stable." The word relieved landed with a particular weight. It implied that stability had not always been available in our family. It implied a contrast that did not need to be named. "Nora and I were just catching up," Richard said. "I had no idea she was family." My mother blinked. Something flickered behind her eyes, a recalculation. "Nora," she said, the word carrying just enough distance to signal that Nora was a category separate from family. "Yes. She does a little consulting work, I think. Something on the computer." She smiled at Richard. "We're so proud of her, getting back on her feet." Getting back on her feet. 11 years of Meridian Creative, $412,000 in the last fiscal year alone, 11 active clients, 3 contractors, a wait list, and my mother summarized it as getting back on her feet with the delivery of someone granting a generous concession. I watched Richard's face. He was too professional to let it change dramatically, but something shifted in his eyes. The expression of a man recalibrating, not Nora's family, but the context he had just been handed about Nora's family. A little consulting work, Richard repeated. His voice was entirely neutral. My mother said. Richard looked at me. The Meridian rebrand was one of the most comprehensive brand strategy engagements our firm has ever commissioned, he said, directly and without qualification. Nora rebuilt our entire communication architecture. We are a 140-person company. That project touched every department. He paused. It was not a little consulting work. The silence that followed was not long. 3 seconds, maybe 4. But it had a weight that 3 seconds does not normally carry. My mother's champagne glass moved slightly in her hand. The smile on her face stayed in place, but it had become effortful, the kind of smile that is no longer communicating warmth but is instead simply occupying the space where a response should be. And then she said the thing that I have replayed so many times since that evening. The thing that revealed, in 10 words, everything my mother understood about the world and everything she had never understood about me. She turned to Richard with a graciousness that had gone a shade too sharp at the edges and said, "Well, I suppose she was due for something to work out eventually. I suppose she was due. Not, I am so proud of what she built. Not, I had no idea the scope of her work. Not even silence, which would have been survivable. She took the information that I had spent a decade building into something irrefutable and she reduced it to luck. To inevitability. To the natural outcome of a scratched label sitting on a shelf long enough for someone to eventually pick it up." Richard Okafor looked at my mother for a moment. Then he looked at me. Then he did something I had not anticipated. He picked up a clean glass from the table, poured a small amount of champagne from the nearby bottle, and raised it in my direction. Not at the room. Not at the table. At me. To Meridian Creative, he said. And to the person who built it. There are moments of vindication that come in the form of explosions. And there are moments of vindication that come in the form of a single raised glass from a man who billed you $87,000 because you earned every cent of it. Richard's champagne glass in the air above table 11 was quieter than an explosion. It was also more permanent. I raised my water glass. Eli raised his. 3 glasses, table 11, in front of no one and everyone. My mother set her champagne flute down on the nearest surface and walked away. What happened in the hours that followed operated with the particular momentum of truths that have been compressed for a very long time. Richard spent the rest of the cocktail hour talking to Marcus and 2 of his groomsmen, and I later learned from Marcus himself that Richard had spent a significant portion of that conversation describing the scope of the Meridian engagement in specific, unambiguous terms. Marcus, who had married into my family that very afternoon and who was a thoughtful and perceptive man, came to find me during the dancing portion of the evening. He sat down at table 11, which several guests had gravitated toward by that point, as tables sometimes do when interesting things have happened at them. "Nora," Marcus said. He had loosened his tie. He looked like a man who had been processing something. "I owe you an apology. You didn't do anything." "I set the seating chart," he said. I looked at him. "Cassandra set the seating chart. With input I should have pushed back on," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know. About your company. About the work you do. Every time her family talked about you, it was," he stopped himself. I should have asked more questions. I appreciated that he said it. I also understood that it came 12 hours too late and 14 months too late and, if I'm being honest, about 12 years too late. But Marcus Webb was a man who, when he realized he had made an error, named it without being asked to. That is rarer than people think. Cassandra found me near the end of the evening, by the coat check, when most of the guests had moved to the outdoor fire pit area for the late-night portion of the reception. She was holding her bouquet by the stems, the flowers slightly wilted after hours of photographs. She looked like a woman who had spent her wedding day containing something. "Eli was very brave," she said. "He was," I agreed. She was quiet for a moment. The coat check attendant busied himself with something on the other side of the room. I heard what Mom said. At the toast. Another pause. I heard what she called you. I waited. I should have given you a speech, Cassandra said. You organized half of this wedding. You drove 4 hours to every fitting. You did the centerpiece mock-ups at your kitchen table. And I gave you table 11 and let Mom take the microphone and her voice broke, just slightly, in the way voices break when someone is trying very hard not to cry at their own wedding reception. I don't know when I stopped protecting you. I don't know when I started letting it happen. I had been waiting, somewhere under everything, for my sister to say something like this for a very long time. The fact that it arrived on her wedding day, in a coat check room with a wilting bouquet, was not the version I had imagined. But I have learned, over the course of 38 years, that the versions you imagine are rarely the ones that actually arrive. What arrives is always more complicated and more human and somehow more true. You don't have to protect me, I told her. I built a company that does $400,000 a year. I can protect myself. I let that sit. But I'd like my sister back. If that's something you want. Cassandra looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Where have you been sitting this whole time?" Table 11. Come outside with us. I went. My mother left the reception early. She said she had a headache. She said her feet hurt. She said goodbyes to the people she needed to say goodbye to, and she found me once, near the door, and she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was not an apology. I want to be precise about this. It was not remorse, exactly, or even acknowledgement. It was something closer to the expression of a person who has delivered what they believed was a carefully placed shot and watched it land in a place they had not calculated. It was the look of a woman who had just discovered that the map she had been using was missing a significant portion of the territory. She said, "I hope you know I'm proud of you, Nora." I said, "I know you believe that, Mom." And then she left. The night air came in through the open door, cool and sharp with the smell of the mill pond and the September grass, and I stood there for a moment before going back to Cassandra and Marcus and table 11 and my 12-year-old son, who had already found his way to the fire pit and was having what appeared to be a very serious conversation with Richard Okafor about the Robert Caro biography. The drive home was quiet in the way of drives that have too much in them for easy conversation. Eli was in the passenger seat in his dress shirt with the tie loosened, watching the highway lights. I drove for 20 minutes before either of us said anything. Then Eli said, "Was that okay?" What I did. I kept my eyes on the road. "Why did you say it?" He thought about it. "Because she said that thing about scratched labels and I looked at you and you were counting." He paused. "You always count to 5 when you're not going to say something." And I thought, another pause. I thought this time someone should say something. I did not pull over. I kept driving. But I reached across and put my hand on the back of his head the way I have since he was small, and I held it there for a moment, and I said, "Yeah, Eli. It was okay." The Monday after the wedding, I got 3 new client inquiries in my inbox before 10 in the morning. By Wednesday, there were 6. By the end of that first week, I had received 11 messages from people in Marcus's professional network, healthcare executives, communications directors, a regional nonprofit, 2 mid-size firms whose names I recognized from industry newsletters, all of them saying some variation of the same thing. "Richard Okafor told me about your work. I'd love to set up a call." 11 inquiries in 5 business days. For context, my previous record for a single week was 2. I sat in my home office on that Friday afternoon looking at my inbox with the particular feeling of watching something you spent years building quietly suddenly become visible all at once. Not because anything about it had changed. Because the right person had said the right thing in the right room. That is the strange arithmetic of credibility. The work was always there. It simply needed a witness. Richard called me that Thursday. He was matter-of-fact about it in the way he is matter-of-fact about most things. He said he had mentioned me to several colleagues and that he hoped I didn't mind. I told him I did not mind. He said he wanted to flag that Caldwell and Pine's contract was coming up for renewal in January and that he intended to expand the scope of the engagement, which he estimated would increase the annual billing by roughly 40%. He said this without fanfare, as a piece of logistical information, the way professionals communicate when they respect each other's time. I wrote the number down on a notepad after I hung up. I stared at it for a while. Then I went and made Eli a grilled cheese and didn't say anything about it because I had learned over 12 years of single parenthood that the best way to metabolize good news is slowly and quietly and with cheese. Of the 11 inquiries that arrived that first week, I took 5. That is the thing about building a business the right way, you eventually reach a point where you can be selective, and being selective is not arrogance, it is the compounded return on a decade of not being selective, of taking every client you could find, of working at midnight and 5 in the morning, of building the reputation first and worrying about the revenue later. I onboarded those 5 clients over the following 2 months. I hired a second part-time contractor, a woman named Greta who had left a downtown agency to freelance and who was, as it turned out, extraordinary. By December, Meridian Creative had 14 active accounts. By February, I had converted my 3rd bedroom, which had been functioning as a graveyard for unused exercise equipment and Eli's outgrown baseball gear, into a proper second office. Cassandra called the Sunday after the wedding. She called from her honeymoon, which was a thing I had not expected and which required me to sit down. She was somewhere on the Amalfi Coast with Marcus and she sounded like herself in a way she hadn't sounded around me in several years. She asked about Eli. She asked about the business. She asked questions that were real questions, the kind that require an actual answer rather than the kind that are asked while already formulating the next thing to say. We talked for 45 minutes. At the end of the call she said, "I want to know what's actually happening in your life, Nora. Not the version Mom describes. The real version." I told her the real version. It took several more phone calls to get through all of it. But we got through it. We are still getting through it, which is how real things work. Marcus, for his part, became an unexpected ally in a way I had not anticipated. He is the kind of person who, once he has identified that he has been operating on faulty information, goes to considerable lengths to correct for it. He told the story of the Meridian engagement to his own professional network with a completeness and specificity that was, frankly, more thorough than my own marketing. I did not ask him to do this. He simply did it because it was accurate and because he is the kind of man who considers accuracy a form of respect. I understood, watching this unfold, why Cassandra had chosen him. The fallout at my mother's end of things was slower and less dramatic than the kind you read about in stories where justice arrives like a thunderclap. Real consequence rarely announces itself. It tends to accrue, quietly, in the way that water finds every crack. What happened to my mother after the wedding was not a public unraveling. It was more like a gradual, gentle subtraction. The women she lunched with at the country club twice a month, women who had been at the wedding, women who had heard the scratched label toast and watched a 12-year-old stand up and correct the record and watched Richard Okafor raise his glass, those women did not stop inviting her to lunch. They simply began talking to her differently. The particular warmth that exists between women who share a narrative contracted slightly, because the narrative had developed complications that hadn't been there before. My mother has always ruled her social world through the management of a story. When the story develops a whole, the management becomes effortful. And the effort shows, eventually, in ways she cannot fully control. Her neighbor, a woman named Diane who had been close to my mother for 20 years and who had attended the wedding with her husband, sent me a direct message on Instagram 3 weeks after the reception. I did not know Diane had found my Instagram. She said she had followed the link from Meridian's professional page. Her message was 4 sentences long. She said she had seen what happened at the wedding and that she was sorry. She said she had always liked me and that she thought I should know that several people were saying so to each other. She said my son had impressed everyone in that room. She said she hoped I was doing well. I read that message 4 times and then I sat with it for a while, not because of what it meant for my mother's social standing but because of what it meant in a different, smaller, more essential way. It meant that I had not been invisible. All those years of absorbing and walking away with my chin up, people had seen it. They had just not said so. Which is its own complicated thing to reckon with, the question of why we wait to tell each other what we actually see. My mother called me 6 weeks after the wedding. I was in the car, waiting in the school pickup line for Eli. She asked how I was. She asked how Eli was doing. She asked about the business in a way that was different from before, not dismissively, but carefully, the way someone handles something they have recently discovered is more fragile or more substantial than they assumed. I answered her questions. I kept my voice level. At the end of the call she said, "I've been thinking about what I said at the toast." She did not say I'm sorry. She did not say it was wrong. She said, "I've been thinking about it," and then she was quiet, and I understood that this was the closest she knew how to come to the edge of the thing without going over it. Some people never go over that edge. I have spent a long time waiting for my mother to go over it, and I have recently made my peace with the possibility that she may never fully cross it. That peace is not forgiveness, and it is not acceptance, and it is not surrender. It is something more practical. It is the decision to stop measuring my own life against the distance between where my mother is and where I need her to be. I said, "I know you've been thinking about it, Mom." And I meant it without bitterness. And then Eli got in the car and threw his backpack in the back seat and said something about a history project, and the conversation shifted the way conversations shift when 12-year-olds arrive with their specific gravitational pull, and my mother and I said goodbye and I pulled out of the school parking lot and drove home. The thing I want to tell you about Eli is that he did not fully understand what he had done at that wedding until later. When I tried to explain it to him about a month afterward, he listened with the focused patience he brings to things he wants to understand correctly. I told him about Meridian's growth since that night. I told him about Richard's referrals. I told him about Cassandra calling from Italy. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I just said what was true." I told him yes, that's exactly what he did. He said, "Why didn't anyone else do it sooner?" I did not have a clean answer for that. I told him that was the question I had been asking myself for 38 years. He thought about this for a while and then said, "Maybe people need to see someone else do it first." He said it in the way he says things sometimes, without realizing that he has just accurately summarized something that has taken philosophers considerably longer to articulate. Then he asked if we could get tacos for dinner and we got tacos, and I thought about what he said for the rest of the night. Maybe people need to see someone else do it first. I have turned this over and over since he said it. Because I think he was right. I think what happened at that reception was not simply about a 12-year-old embarrassing his grandmother or a VP raising a glass or a satellite client recognizing his brand strategist at a family event. I think what happened was that someone in that room did the thing no one had done in 38 years. Someone said what was true, out loud, in front of witnesses, without flinching. And once that thing is said, once one person names the real version clearly enough for 200 people to hear, the false version cannot occupy the same space anymore. It does not have room. The truth, once spoken at the right volume in the right room, has a kind of permanence that the careful management of a narrative cannot match. My mother has been managing a narrative about me for most of my adult life. My 12-year-old son unmade it in 2 sentences. He did it without malice. He did it without theater. He did it because it was simply, factually, undeniably true, and because he loved me enough to say so. I want to say something about the grief of it, because I would be leaving out something essential if I didn't. The business grew. The relationships shifted. The seating chart at every family gathering from that point on has looked different, and no one has made me sit at table 11 again. All of that is real. But underneath all of it there is a loss that I do not talk about as often because it does not have a satisfying shape. I still do not have the mother I wanted. I still drive to family events occasionally and feel the low-grade bracing sensation of a woman preparing for impact. My mother is still more comfortable with the version of me that needed saving than with the version of me that doesn't. We are not estranged. We are not reconciled. We are in the complicated middle space that many adult children and their parents occupy, present with each other, trying, careful, aware of the distances that remain even when we are in the same room. I do not want to tell you that the vindication fixed everything, because it didn't. I want to tell you that it changed enough. It changed enough that I can tell the real version of my life in front of my sister. It changed enough that Eli knows his mother was always worth standing up for. It changed enough that I no longer need my mother to see what I built in order to know it's real. What I understand now, that I could not have understood without all of it, without the coral dress and the table 11 and the scratched label and the raised glass and the drive home in the dark, is that being underestimated by the people who should know you best is not evidence of who you are. It is only evidence of the limit of what they were able to see. My mother could not see me clearly. That failure of vision shaped my entire life. It caused real damage. I do not minimize that. But the person I became while she wasn't looking, the business I built, the son I raised, the 12 years of midnight work and early mornings and believing in my own worth without external confirmation, that person was built precisely because I could not borrow my mother's opinion of me. I had to develop my own. And it turns out that the opinion you develop of yourself in the absence of any outside validation is the most durable kind there is. Eli is 13 now. He is taller than he was at the wedding and somehow even more confident in the specific, quiet way he has always been confident, not the kind that needs a room's attention but the kind that exists with or without it. He helps with Meridian's social presence on weekends when he wants to. He has informed me that he plans to study political science or economics or possibly both, and when I ask him why he says because decisions are interesting and most people make them badly. He is 13. I do not tell him what to study. I just keep the office door open and let him watch the work happen, the way he has always watched, the way that apparently produces young men who stand up in reception halls and say true things clearly. I consider that the most significant thing I have ever built. More than the company. More than the client list. More than the 14 accounts or the wait list or the February office renovation. The boy who stood up before I could. That is my actual life's work, and it was never scratched. Thank you so much for staying until the very end of this story. If it moved you, if any part of it felt like something you've lived or something you needed to hear, please share it with someone who needs it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. There are more stories on the screen right now that I think you'll love. I'll see you in the next one.